What's up, hobby friends? Welcome to Hobby Hangouts, where I ramble about my hobby and hopefully you find it entertaining. In this week's episode, we're going to be talking about my Necrons. I want to briefly talk about my army, the narrative behind it, the list I'm currently running, why I've made the choices I've made, what I've learned from the games I've played so far against predominantly Space Marines, entirely Space Marines, and then my approach or my plan for how I'm going to continue to adapt as I learn more from the games I play and as more armies are released for 9th edition. So I've been playing Necrons since 3rd edition, and this will be the 3rd time I've collected the Necron army. So I did one iteration of it in 3rd, one in 5th, and currently, I guess, the end of 8th and the start of 9th. Each time I collect an army, even if it's the same army, in this case Necrons, I tend to want to collect the army and play it in a different way, just to keep things interesting. It's boring for me to keep redoing the army and continually doing it the same way. I want it to be a fresh and new experience, and I approached this Necron army the same way. Back in 3rd, I ran a Silver Tide with warriors and immortals backed up by heroes. In 5th edition, I ran a mix of vehicles, a lot of annihilation barges and a lot of immortals. Back then you had the different cryptic harbingers, and the Veil of Darkness wasn't a one-use thing. And so I ran a triple Veil essentially list. 2 Harbingers of the Storm and a Veil of Darkness with Oberon. And we would essentially have 3 teleporting blocks of immortals and close combat heroes backed up by a couple of shooting annihilation barges. The army was very mobile. It played keep away and focused on objectives and board control. The way I currently play my army, I am running a Destroyer Cult themed list. We mostly play casual narrative games within our gaming group, so I am not as concerned about the competitiveness or the optimization of my army. I know I make choices that aren't top meta, but I build the army for a theme, and then I try and play that army to the best of my ability because I am still a fairly competitive player. I like to win, no one likes to lose. The story behind my Necron Dynasty has been an evolving narrative. It was originally a subsection of the Minarch Dynasty. I really liked the fluff behind their Arch Cryptek, Tolhog the Blind. He was responsible for a lot of the constructs and a lot of the war machines that the Triarch and the Silent King would deploy to their battlefields. This suited my approach to the army because I was heavily converting a lot of my units. So I like the idea that my army was essentially a test bed for Tolhog. He would create these constructs and then deploy them, at least initially, in limited amounts with my army to test them against enemies before mass producing them and distributing them to the legions. With the release of the new book and the option to start creating custom dynasties, I have expanded the narrative of my army. It is now a new dynasty, which I've called the Hexakasut, and they are a vassal kingdom of the Minarch. So they are still an extension of Tolhog's wild, crazy machinations, but I'm able to veer away from official rules. I don't know if Forge World's Minarch rules are still legal play, but by using the custom dynasty rules, I can craft the narrative of my force while keeping with something that I've continuously been evolving. The inspiration for the Hexakasut is actually drawn from the Egyptian Empire. Their 15th dynasty was called the Hyksos, or, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, the Hekau-Kasut, which roughly translates to Wandering Kings or the Shepherd Kings. And basically, they were this Asiatic tribe that journeyed into Egypt, settled in, and took over the southern part of the domain and ruled for about 100 years. They had 6 pharaohs, and I think they ruled concurrently with the 13th and 14th dynasty before being pushed out and conquered by what would become known as the New Kingdom, the Egypt that we know from popular history, from all the films and TV shows. One thing I liked about the Hyksos was that they were known for their technological innovation. They actually brought a lot of technology, particularly military, to Egypt. They were credited with bringing the composite bow, the scythed sword, and most importantly, the horse and chariot. And I felt that that combined with the reputation for being nomadic conquerors, suited what I wanted for my Necrons. So I sort of adapted their Egyptological pronunciation, the Hekau Kasut, along with their more common name, the Hyksos, combined them, and I have my dynasty name. So to suit the narrative of this dynasty, I've chosen for my tradition the Eternal Conquerors. Because I'm not going to have a lot of troops, I won't have a lot of objectives secured on the board. Taking Eternal Conquerors shores up that weakness, and it also really fits the narrative of the army. They're always about warfare, they're about conquering their foes, subjugating their foes, and expanding the Necron Empire. And I felt that that tradition was very appropriate. For the Circumstance of Awakening, I've chosen Relentlessly Expansionist, which ties in with them being conquerors. They're continuously expanding the borders of the Empire. They're coming into conflict with their enemies. This just takes the aggression with which I can play the army to an 11. Giving me that free 6-inch move. Helps to reposition from a poor deployment, get into forward positions of cover, or if I know I can take first turn, make really aggressive moves onto the objectives and to taking the center of the board, which I currently think is one of the key strategies of Ninth. The player that controls this central part of the board typically controls the tempo of the game. So I've been playing with the new Necrons for probably about a month and a half now with the new book, running the initial list I came up with through my first reading of the book. I want to cover that list, talk about the thoughts that I made when choosing the units for that army, and then what I've learned from the games I've played and why I am making the changes I am making for the next batch of games as new books are released. So the original list I came up with is running the Vanguard detachment. For the 2 HQs, it's the Command Barge as the Warlord. I've given him the Warlord trait Enduring Will. He's armed with a War Scythe, a Gauss Cannon, and I've given him the Nanoscarab Casket. For my second HQ, I've taken the Skorpekh Lord. For my 3 Elite, I have the Nightbringer, who has the Antimatter Meteor, Catan Power, as well as his Gaze of Death. I have 5 Skorpekh Destroyers and a Hexmark Destroyer. I've taken 1 troops unit of 10 warriors with Gauss Reapers, and I've put them in a Ghost Ark transport. I have 2 fast attack, 10 Triarch Praetorians with Rods of the Covenant, and 3 Ophydian Destroyers. And then for my 2 heavies, I have 5 Lokhust Destroyers with Gauss Cannons, and 3 Lokhust Heavy Destroyers with Gauss Destructors. So that totals 2,000 points, and because I've spent 3 command points for my detachment, I start the game with 9, bumped up to 10 on my first turn. So this army is themed around the Destroyer cult, and it essentially includes one of each of them. It includes all of the new units, it includes the new and tooled up Nightbringer, it brings the warriors with their new Gauss weapons, and Praetorians, which on paper are they seem like a really solid beat stick, and it's something that I don't have or I didn't have in my collection prior to the new book coming out, so I wanted to add them. So looking through the codex, in order to take advantage of protocols, you need to have a noble, and unfortunately there's only a few models that fit that criteria. And if I'm going to be bringing a destroyer cult army with all of these expensive units, I don't have room to sort of fuck about, and I don't want to pay the cheap tax of taking a Lord or Overlord who are going to be incredibly squishy and provide nothing to the game. And I don't want to take any of the named characters, which really only left the Command Barge, which is fine because I had a Command Barge just waiting to be painted up. And with the Warlord trait and the Relic, he's actually surprisingly tanky. So being able to keep him alive through those, as well as the new quantum shielding rules, as well as the quantum shielding stratagem, I found that he very rarely goes down. In fact, I actually haven't lost him in any of my games. He's come close, but through clever use of Living Metal and the Living Metal protocol, he's been able to stay alive long enough for my army to do what they need to do. So because I'm also running predominantly Destroyer Cult, I know I want a Destroyer Cult character to go alongside the Command Barge. And you really only have 2 choices. It's the Lokhust Lord or the Skorpekh Lord. And I think between the two, the Skorpekh Lord is just the better choice. It does cost a little more in points, but he's got a better weapon skill stat. He's got some guns, and his damage profile, especially with the Harvester, is just much, much higher than the Lokhust Lord. It's sort of a no-brainer between the two. If you have the points, you take the Skorpekh Lord. To fill my elites, I actually wanted to bring a lot of things. I had to trim down the army to fit in everything I wanted. The Nightbringer was a no-brainer to fit in. I've loved the model since it came out in 3rd. I know it's a little dated. A lot of people aren't a big fan of the model, especially compared to the new Void Dragon, but I think it's a cool little piece of history. I've had the model for probably 7 or 8 years, and it's a nice excuse to be able to field one and actually have it be terrifying on the battlefield. The amount of damage that this guy can do and does that I've experienced from the game is without comparison. In reflection, I actually think that the Nightbringer doesn't fit in my list because everything else is so expensive. Having so many points tied up in one model that doesn't really do anything if he's not in combat or within 9 inches is actually a huge detriment. And I found myself wishing that I had other things in my army instead of the Nightbringer. Not to say that he isn't good, he just isn't good in my army and he's actually being dropped out, but I will touch on that later. To continue the narrative, I've taken one each of the different destroyer units. I have the Skorpeks, I have the Hexmark, the Ophydians, the Lokhust normals, and the Lokhust heavy destroyers. Whether they're all good or not, my initial impression was that Ophydians are just bad. In terms of stats, they're just weaker versions of Skorpekh destroyers. Their movement is only marginally increased at 2 inches, but they have a lower strength, toughness, a worse save, and if I wanted a fast unit that was more durable, Wraiths were the better choice. But for completion and to fit the narrative, I took them in, and I've been trying to make them work, and I've actually really enjoyed what they bring to the table. Their ability to start the game in reserve by burrowing, along with the Hexmark's dimensional translocation ability, means that they can deploy from reserve and threaten parts of the board that I'm not currently in. It forces my opponent to have to consider units that may appear in locations that he hasn't covered, the potential to flip backfield objectives or go for objectives like Linebreaker, or just get behind him and throw a wrench in his plans has been really invaluable and has forced my opponent to hold back units that he would normally be pushing forward. And I think that armies that don't invest in cheap back units to hold objectives and cover the board are going to be heavily penalized against units that can deep strike behind them. That's actually also one of the reasons why I love the Hexmark Destroyer. His shooting on paper is god-awful. Like, I don't think he's killed more than a single Marine a turn. It's incidental shooting, but he's a character, so he gives up protocols. With my Dynasty, he's objective secured, so he can steal objectives from those who aren't. And he's also only 75 points. So he's dirt cheap for what he does. And I've been trying some different relics with him. The Gauntlet of Conflagration, which is ass against Space Marines, just FYI. And I've considered taking the Veil of Darkness as a cheeky way to help rescue my warriors or to bump my warriors, but I think I'd rather just save the CP. I think just the 75 points for the basic Hexmark, supported by 3 Ophidians, is a really nice tech unit to be able to throw in the backfield. It doesn't cost a lot of points. They're only about 180 points for the 2 of them, and they can get a lot done. I really love this Skorpekh destroyers, especially with the stratagem Whirlwind Onslaught, making things -1 to wound against them. Makes them surprisingly tanky. They're not going to survive a dedicated counter assault, and if they get charged, they're probably going to die. So they're very much a suicide missile, I found. I pick the biggest part of the enemy, either Death Star unit or units, throw the Skorpekh at them, delete them, trade them, and I'm happy with that trade. I'm curious to try a plasma sight with the unit, but I can't ever seem to find the 20 points to fit in the army. I may try in the future or in future iterations, but for now, I think Skorpechs, they do the job well. You just have to be careful with not being shot up on the way in, making sure that you get the charge off, and then being okay with losing them. They're one of the units I expect to lose by the end of the game. They very rarely survive, but they do the job. I think the Praetorians are one of the best units in the book. Their shooting and close combat attacks at strength 5 damage 2 with Ren 3 means they just delete Marines and can put a dent in even more heavily armored Marines like Gravis and Heroes. The ability to make them 2+ to hit in combat or shooting with the stratagem Judgment of the Triarch makes them really consistent, and with 3 attacks per model, they will delete whatever they touch. They're a surprisingly durable fast unit that I can throw down a flank relatively unsupported because they're very self-sufficient. I can depend on them to hold a flank or to secure a flank without much support. I think the Lokhust destroyers and Lokhust heavy destroyers are overpriced for what they do, but the army needs some mid and long range shooting because the only new books in the current meta are Space Marines and Necrons. I'm facing a lot of multi-wound models and units, and I found that weapons that do damage 1 from Warriors, Immortals, and Tomb Blades just don't do enough damage. And so I pay a premium for them, but I think the destroyers are really, really good against Marines. And I think heavy destroyers are actually really, really good against tanks. I think the Doomsday Ark has higher damage potential for the exact same points. However, it can't move and shoot with the same effectiveness. It degrades, which I guess you can equate to the heavy destroyers losing models over time simply because you're not going to reanimate them, let's be honest. However, each wound that goes through from a heavy destroyer is a minimum of 3 damage. I think that 3 of them will put up more consistent damage over a 5-turn game than a Doomsday Ark will. They're smaller, they're easier to hide, and they can move and shoot without penalty. So I like them. I like them a lot more than the Doomsday Arks that I used to run. I also have 10 warriors in the army. I like the Reapers. They're short ranged, but their high strength, high AP means they're really, really good at getting stuck in and sort of finishing off weakened squads. Because they are objective secured, the count is double with the Dynasty tradition. And keeping them in the Ghost Ark means I can throw them in a flank, typically opposite my Praetorians, and support with some secondary fire. But really what they're there to do is take an objective and hold it for as long as possible. I also really love my Ghost Ark model, and I want to field it in pretty much every game I play. Every list I write almost always starts with those 10 warriors in the Ghost Ark. So one of the biggest flaws in this army that I found from all the games I've played is that I have too many hammers. I have too many expensive units that they're really deadly, but I can't afford to have units that are just purely blocking or units that are designed to just sit back and hold objectives. There have been a couple of games I've played where I've had to keep something like 10 Praetorians holding a backfield objective and unable to advance them because I have nothing else to secure the flank, and not holding that objective would cost me primary points. And I think part of this problem is the Nightbringer. He's 350 points of fucking I'm gonna ruin your day, but the entire army is designed to ruin your day. He's just a win bigger or lose bigger unit in my army. And so one of the biggest changes I'm making to the list is I'm actually dropping him. What I'm going to get in return is another Hexmark, 3 more Ophydians, a Resurrection Orb on my command barge, and 2 units of Scarabs, 3 and 4. This gives me a lot more objective secured units on the board, a lot more fast units, especially in the Scarabs, who I can use to throw up and secure outlying objectives without overcommitting a unit I want to be in combat. And in my mind, I've really loved the options that a Hexmark and 3 Ophydians have given me arriving from reserve. And I figure, why not take 2 of them? Why not double up on that and see what happens? I think doubling up might be an overinvestment in the tech, but I have the models already, so I'm gonna try it out. If it doesn't work, I may switch over to something else. Another idea I did have was only taking 6 Scarabs, so 3 and 3. And instead of taking the Hexmark and the Ophydians, taking 10 Deathmarks. Based on the way the Necron book works, the way that their heroes support and buff the army, and the way Space Marines work, the way their heroes buff and support their army, particularly apothecaries and chaplains. I think a lot of future books are going to have that same mechanic. Heroes that sit around supporting their armies, but being really vulnerable. So if you can pick them out, you're moving tools and you're making your opponent's army just collectively weaker. And I think that having units that can bypass or lookouts there, like Deathmarks, be really, really good at picking off key support heroes and softening them up for your army to charge in and finish the job. One thing as well that this army really suffers from is the new Reanimation Protocols. The way they've changed them, I don't agree with it. I understand why. And it's something you have to play around. Because the army is predominantly multi-wound models, I don't ever expect to reanimate. It occasionally happens for my Praetorians, but I have yet to reanimate successfully a destroyer model. I don't expect it to happen. It's one of the weaknesses of the army, and it's where I pay points for that I don't get the benefit of. That's also one of the reasons why I want to take the Resurrection Orb on the Command Barge. I think that out of turn 4+ reanimation can help bolster a squad that has been weakened and give them a second run or a second chance at life. Another thing that I was actually hesitant about with the new book, but I've really thoroughly enjoyed, is the change to quantum shielding. On paper, not being able to just flat out ignore high damage weapons seems like it's worse. But in practice, gaining that flat 5+ invulnerable save or 4+ with the quantum shielding stratagem, and then just straight out ignoring wounds on an unmodified 1, 2, or 3 has actually saved my Command Barge from taking damage more times than I can count. And then finally, objective secured. Whether you're playing for narrative or competitive, I think if you're not taking the objective secured, you need a damn good reason not to. I also think that by not being objective secured across the board, the army is just inherently weaker. Because you only have a limited number of turns to score a limited number of objective points, every turn matters. And it doesn't matter if you are wiped or if you wipe out your opponent. If you can't take those points, you're not going to win the game. I really like the fact that every unit, except for the Praetorians in my army, is objective secured. I can simply walk up, and if you're not a troop, I'm taking that objective from you. Vice versa, if you're not a troop, you're not taking the objective from me. So that's it. That's where I'm at with the army. As you can see, I am also currently working to expand it. So I've got my Hexmark, which is almost done, and I have 3 Ophydians and my 6th Skorpekh waiting to be painted. I'm hoping to have those done by the end of the month, and I can go into 2021 with my Mark II or 2.0 Necron list fully painted and ready to play. And as I continue to play games and as I continue to play against the newer armies that are released, I will release future videos covering very similar to this, sort of my thoughts and experiences on the army, how it's currently playing, and what I'm continuing to learn, and how I'm adapting and evolving my army to keep up with the continuing changes to 9th edition. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to check out my Instagram at SirJohnTheHoe for daily updates on my hobby content, and like and subscribe for more awesome videos. Until next time, happy hobbying.